Hello, everybody. Welcome to our penultimate meeting for the quarter. We'll be going over hands. It's a pretty broad topic. It's probably one of the more tedious parts of rigging, at least for a biped character. We're all going to be going over various parts of like hand rigging. Oh, hey James. Um, yeah, so we'll get started. Roman will start it off for us. So yeah, take it away, Roman.
Yes, I will. So, as he said, this is pretty much the hand rigs, and like you said, it's mostly just tedious kind of work. And yeah, so let's get right into it. So the main points of like what makes it so difficult is like the amount of joints and nodes that go into making a hand, because there's a lot of locomotion and just movement in the hands in general. So all the joints that you need down there are just it can create a giant mess. But also you have to pay attention to the joint placement of the hands, because the we went over this a while ago in one of our other meetings about like joint placement in the body, where joints are like you have to place it like sometimes where you don't think there would be joints. So hands are kind of like that, where it's just like wherever it kind of moves, like at the base of it, and you have to just pay attention to where you're kind of putting your joints, so it's not all messed up. And then controller placement and convenience, so that it's not a whole mess to select all the fingers, like each individual finger, but then so you can also select all the fingers easily. Um, and yeah, in summary, it's challenging due to the number of things they have to create and keep in mind. Let's keep going. And so the common functionality is the set driven key floats, the set driven key poses, the FK controls, and the IK handle finger planting.
Yeah, I'll be talking a little bit about joint placement. Essentially, each finger will have about three joints for each knuckle and an end joint to help with joint orientation. And then the thumb will be a little different because it'll have two joints plus an end joint. Essentially, I would basically kind of look at your own fingers. So if you hear my door open, um, is that really loud? Like, should I just close the door? Or
Anything.
okay.
You're all good.
Just wanted to make sure. I live on a very busy street, so if it does get too loud, let me know. Um, Anyways, essentially, you want to look like a good reference would be your own hand and how it moves, where your knuckles are placed. That's essentially like a good way or a good reference for joint placement. And also, if your hand has good topology for animation, it should help with placing joints. So commonly, you could have like edge loops run along the crease lines, so where it bends. Sometimes there might be like extra edge loops around like each finger knuckle. So that would be a good place to place your joints. Um, but yeah, essentially kind of looking at your own hands, like this is kind of one of the times where you can kind of reference human anatomy to help with joint placement. And then I'll talk briefly about joint orientations. Typically, for me, I like to have my joints oriented to where the x-axis is prominent direction, facing outwards, it's running through the finger. And then the y-axis will be pointed upwards. The thumb will be a little bit different. It'll be pointed towards the body, and sometimes this can be kind of based on how the hand is modeled, how the finger is modeled. But typically it won't be oriented the exact same way as the other fingers because the thumb is kind of placed differently on your hand. So the y-axis will pretty much be facing almost towards your own body.
I will be going over some other functionality that you can really achieve. A bit briefly, I can go into specifics on these functionality if you want to. But one of the most common ones you'll see that's besides a regular FK setup is floats. We basically just create attributes for certain rotations on your finger that are just default float values, so they have an infinite minimum and maximum value. Their defaults are 0 probably, and you just connect the this attribute to a certain rotation on your finger. So for this rig, I just needed to get some basic curls in for the entire for each finger. So I just hooked up the float attribute to the rotate Z of these fingers here, so that they would just all curl with one attribute to make it a little easier to use. It's basically achieved through just directly connecting your attributes to a singular rotation attribute on the joint or the control, depending on how you handle it. Because I have seen rigs where it is exclusively based upon float attributes, so they are just directly connecting it to the joint. But in this case, it's to the offset group of the controls. Another setup that I've used is just set driven key poses. So the problem with using strict floats is that you will, if you try to use it to make a fist, for example, you will probably not have a good default pose, and you'll inevitably need to go in and tweak the FK controls a little bit more to get a good fist pose. This is kind of the opposite of that. You design a set driven key that goes from your base pose. Its negative is its positive maximum will be the pose that you desire, and the negative minimum will be the inverse pose that you can use. So for this case, I have like a attribute for a fist, and when I set it to -10, it stretches out like it's kind of like a open palm. Or a curl attribute, which is basically the fist attribute without the thumb accounted for. Or the scrunch, which can kind of allow you to like push your fingers in as if you're kind of gripping something, or stretch out like you're kind of doing like a bit of like a surfing motion with your fingers. Or a spread attribute, which allows you to spread your fingers apart. It requires a lot of focus on the poses to make them usable, but it's also more about setting up a good base pose to use. The problem that you'll run into this, though, is that it takes a lot of like charting of numbers to keep down, because I've never really ran into a situation where I can set for a fist attribute, I can just set most of a single rotation value to -90 and call it a day. So I make sure to write down what the rotation values are, because I do need to keep this in mind for the rest of the fingers when I go through for the index finger, the middle finger, ring finger, etc. The thumb is just kind of a bit of a nightmare, because I did run into having to use multiple axes for the rotations. It's really fun. It's really fun to use. I do recommend giving it a try, but it does it does run into some limitations pretty quickly. The next setup is the most obvious one. It's basic FK control setup. You'll just set up one control per joint. You'll probably end up with about 15 or more controls. I've recently started giving carpal controls because it just allows for more control. So that'll add about another 5 controls to your setup. And if you set them up right, you should be good without your finger getting cluttered. But it do keep like the general design of your rigs in mind when adding carpals. However, there are cases like the Malcolm rig, for example, that do merge the carpals into a singular curl control that kind of allows you to cup the entire fingers through a couple nodes in the node editor. And lastly, we have IK fingers. I never recommend making a separate IK and FK setup for the fingers, because it will get annoying to switch between them. You will want to try and keep the hands as specific to one setup as possible. So I stick to FK and just add a few IK hybrid stuff to it. So you try to get them to overlap as much as possible, and it will allow to solid broad posing at first, whereas the FK comes in for refinement. So here I have like a side roll attribute for the palm, or a palm raise, so you can kind of so if you use IK, you can plant the hand, and you can kind of just move it around without having to interfere with like a bunch of FK controls, or you won't have to like counter animate the hand for certain things. It's pretty fun, and it does take a little bit of setup to do. And it's surprisingly a bit far easier than it seems, but it does take a little bit of setup to do. And it tends to be more FK IK hybrid in approach. The only real issues you'll probably run into is that your pose floats will probably become a little wonky afterwards, because you will be sort of creating an IK setup, so rotations don't become active. It's more about translations. Are there any questions that you all have, or demonstrations that you'd like on certain setups, or just questions in general?
I don't think so.